Hi everyone, welcome to Tax Tutoring and Training. My name's Hannah, and today's lesson is on dependents. So, what is a dependent and how you can claim them for your tax return? As always, there will be a link in the description below for the guided notes to this lesson. The blanks will be highlighted on this slideshow, and you can use these notes as practice because they have extra assignments, or as a way to engage your students if you're training interns for the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. If you need a way to train them, these slides are great, and I will be walking you through them, teaching you what you need to know to pass your certification to become a VITA intern. So with that, let's get started. So, who are dependents? A dependent is a person who qualifies as either a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. Why you would need to identify dependents is when a taxpayer is able to claim dependents, they're able to claim certain credits or refunds that would give them more money back on their tax return. So what's not a dependent is a person who does not file an income tax return or files an income tax return solely to claim a refund of estimated or withheld taxes. So we'll get more into that later. But if you're to claim a dependent, they must be either a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. Now, what does that mean? So this basically means there's two categories on which to classify your dependent as. In order to first classify them, you need to pass all three of these qualifying tests to identify whether they can even be qualified as a dependent in the first place. So these three tests that you have to pass first are the dependent taxpayer test, the joint return test, and the citizen or resident test. Once you determine the questioned dependent passes all these three tests, you will then go to the qualifying child tests and see if they pass all those tests. If they fail even one of the tests, then you will test if they are a qualifying relative. If they fail any one of those tests, then the person in question cannot be claimed as a dependent on the tax return. So now we're going to get into those tests and what exactly they mean. So the tests needed to first identify if the person is eligible to be a qualifying dependent at all, regardless of whether they're a child dependent or a relative dependent, are these three tests: the dependent taxpayer test, the joint return test, and the citizen or resident test. The dependent taxpayer test is a test to see if the person being claimed as a dependent can claim anybody else. So a taxpayer who can be claimed as a dependent can't claim another dependent on their tax return if they fill out a tax return. That's basically to ensure that if you can't support yourself, why would you be able to support another person? So because I'm a high schooler, I would be claimed as a dependent on my parents' tax return, meaning that I cannot claim another child, if I had one, on my own tax return if I filled one out. The second test is the joint return test. And this basically means that a person married filing jointly cannot be claimed as a dependent unless the joint return is filed only to claim a refund or withheld income tax. So we'll get more into filing status in the next video, but a married filing jointly person is someone who is married to a spouse and they agreed to file the return together, meaning they combine their income, they combine their debt, they combine their taxes into one return. If you are married filing jointly, you can't be claimed as a dependent, meaning if you're working with a client who's is the mother of a recent bride. So the mother used to be able to claim her daughter as a dependent, but now she married within this year and she will be filing jointly with her husband. This means that the mother can no longer claim her daughter as a dependent, even if she were to say pay for the wedding or paid for her residence up till the point where she got married and decided to file jointly with her husband. Now, the last test to be considered to be a qualifying dependent is the citizen or resident test, meaning that the dependent in question must be a U.S. citizen, a U.S. resident alien, a U.S. national, or a resident of Canada or Mexico. And the caveat to this is the dependent could be adopted by a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national, and they live with them all year. So if the dependent is adopted by a U.S. citizen, they must live with them all year to be claimed as a dependent on the U.S. citizen's tax return. If any one of these tests is failed at any point, then the person that is trying to be identified as a dependent is not a dependent, and the taxpayer cannot claim them on their tax return. So after you pass those three basic tests to be even considered as a qualifying dependent, then we see what kind of qualifying dependent you are. Are you a qualifying child or a qualifying relative? And to do this, we go through another series of tests. So the tests for a qualifying child dependent include, the first one is the relationship test. So the qualifying child must be the taxpayer's son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, or descendant of any of them. Or they can be the taxpayer's brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or a descendant of any of them. The second test that you have to pass in order to be considered a qualifying child dependent is age. So if the dependent must be under age 19 and younger than the taxpayer in order to be claimed as a dependent. If you're working with a client who's, say, 20 and cares for their younger brother who is age 19, then the older brother who's 20 would be able to claim their 18-year-old brother as a dependent because they're younger than the taxpayer and they're under age 19. But the 20-year-old taxpayer would not be able to claim his 21-year-old older brother because even if they live together and the younger brother is supporting the older brother would not be able to be claimed as a dependent by the younger because he is not younger than the younger brother. A caveat to this is if the dependent is a full-time student. In this case, the age limit is expanded to 24 years old, as long as the dependent is still younger than the taxpayer. So say you come into contact with a client who has a daughter in college, and the daughter is 20. Even though she's over age 19, she is a full-time student, meaning that she can still be claimed as a dependent until she reaches 24, as long as she meets all the other qualifying child dependent tests. Now, there's one other caveat to this age test, and that is the dependent can be claimed at any age if he or she is permanently and totally disabled. So this would be the case of, say you're doing a tax return for a client who is 50 and she has a daughter who is 30, but the daughter is permanently and totally disabled. Even though the daughter is not under age 19 and is not a full-time student and under age 24, she's permanently and totally disabled, meaning she is able to be claimed as a dependent even if she's over both those age limits because she's permanently and totally disabled. The next two tests that a qualifying child dependent must pass is first the residency test, meaning that a child must live with the taxpayer for more than half the year. This counts if either the taxpayer or the child was temporarily absent, and this could be due to illness, vacation, or military leave. Taxpayers may claim may claim as a dependent a child who was born or died if the child lived with them more than half the time they were alive. So in the rare and very unfortunate event that a taxpayer had a child who, say, died before the tax year, so say they died, they were born and they died at 7 months. If the child was in their care and they lived with the taxpayer for at least 3.5 months, so over halfway through, then the taxpayer could still claim the child as a dependent. The last test is the support test, meaning that the child dependent cannot have support provided more than half of his or own support during the tax year. Sometimes taxpayers will have kids that have jobs. I'm in high school, so a lot of my friends will have jobs, but the income they make from those jobs aren't going to their direct support. Direct support is basically housing costs, food costs, cost of living, that sort of thing. It'll usually go into a college fund. That does not count as his or her own support for the tax year. And this includes Social Security benefits. So, can the child be the qualifying child of more than one person? The answer is no. Jointly filing couples can claim the child together because they jointly file. However, sometimes you come in the case of divorced parents or two taxpayers who might have claim to the same dependent. In this case, only one of them will be able to claim the dependent. So you go through a series of questions to determine who is going to claim this child dependent. So, if only one of the taxpayers is the child's parent, the child is a qualifying child for the parent. So, in some situations, say a mother is living with her boyfriend and has a daughter. If the boyfriend is supporting both the mother and the daughter, he wouldn't be able to claim the daughter. If the boyfriend and the mother were both filing separately, filing as in they're both single and filing as single, only the mother, the biological mother, would be able to claim the daughter, not the boyfriend, even if the boyfriend contributes some support to the child. So, if the child passes the test for two taxpayers, so this would be in the case of a divorced relationship sometimes. A formal decision can be made, meaning one taxpayer would waive the right to claim the child for the other. In order to do this, the person who is taking the child must have a higher adjusted gross income, or AGI. If the child lives with both of their divorced parents for the same amount of time, meaning that because you have to, in order to be a qualifying child, you have to live with the taxpayer for more than half the year. If they live with two taxpayers for equal time, then it's the person with the highest adjusted gross income that will be able to claim the child dependent. And like I said, these are rules for divorced parents. If the child is the qualifying child of the custodial parent, and the custodial parent is basically the parent whom the child lived with the greater number of nights. So if the mom took the child for 7 months of the year, and the father took the child for 5 months of the year, then the custodial parent would be the mother because she took the child for 7 months. 7 months, meaning more time. If the time was divided equally, so 6 and 6, then the parent with the highest adjusted gross income would claim the child as their qualifying child dependent. You can make the non-custodial parent eligible to claim the child, but you have to fill out court documentation, which is Form 8332. Okay, so if the dependent in question did not pass any of the qualifying child tests, so if any one of those tests was failed, now you move to see if they could qualify as a qualifying relative dependent. So this basically means this is another set of tests that you would have to go through to see if they qualify as a qualifying relative dependent. If they qualify as a qualifying relative dependent, then you can claim them as a dependent on your tax return and receive some of the credits and refunds that you're eligible for. So, the test we're talking about that you have to pass to be a qualifying relative dependent includes the not a qualifying child test. So, in order to be a qualifying relative dependent, you must have not been eligible to be considered a qualifying child, meaning you failed one of the qualifying child tests. Another test is the member of household or relations test. So this is a dual test, meaning you have to fill one caveat or the other. So the first caveat to this test is the member of household test, meaning that a relative must live as a member of the taxpayer's household all year. So this basically means if you have a friend who is living in your house, and in order to claim them as a dependent, they must live in the house all year. The other test that is eligible for is the relationship test. So you have to be to pass this dual test. You have to be either a member of the household or or have blood or marriage relationship to the taxpayer. So this is in the case of, say, a taxpayer is caring for their mother or father who's old and they live in their own home, then they would have blood or marriage relationship, meaning they would pass this test. The third test that you need to pass if you're a qualifying relative dependent is the gross income test, meaning that the dependent has a gross income less than the threshold. The number on the board is the number used for last year. It changes every year. So when next tax season comes around, it'll be a different number. So you should look that up with your site coordinator, and it will often be in the tax preparation software that you're using to prepare tax returns. So if the taxpayer is caring for a dependent who has a high gross income, so say it's over the threshold, then they are not a qualifying relative dependent and will not be able to be claimed as a dependent on the taxpayer's return. Okay, so one of the final test is the support test, meaning that the taxpayer must have provided more than 50% of the person's total support for the tax year. So in an example before, we mentioned that the taxpayer had a friend living with them all year, so they passed the relationship test / member of household test, the dual test. So if you have a friend that's living with you all year and they're under the adjusted gross income limit, then the last test they have to meet is that the taxpayer must have provided more than 50% of the person's total support. So if your friend's living with you, if the friend is living with the taxpayer had to pay at least over 50% of their support needs, meaning then that can include residential expenses, food, shelter, clothing, that sort of thing, like living expenses. In the case of a multiple support agreement, so sometimes there's two or more people that could claim the dependent together. In this case, this would be a case such as two brothers can both work together to provide more than, let's say, two brothers work together to provide 70% of support of their father. In this case, both the brothers could claim the dependent both the brothers could claim the dependent, but only one can file the multiple support declaration and claim the dependent on their income tax return. So both could, only one can. And this is only for a qualifying relative. This does not count for a qualifying child. As a volunteer income tax assistance intern, part of your responsibilities include interviewing the client or the taxpayer to decide to basically garner this information if they have a dependent or not, because it will be used to calculate refunds and credits on their tax return. So when the client comes in, you as an intern will be sitting down with the intake and interview sheet, and this is basically a questionnaire guide to help you determine part of their filing status, their dependents, and any other information that would be useful to prepare the return. So here we have a clip of the intake and interview document, and this is the section where, as an intern, you would ask questions to determine if a dependent can be listed in this section and the dependent can be claimed, such as date of birth, meaning that you have to check if they're 19 or younger, like we mentioned, 19 or younger, or 24 and younger, like we mentioned in the child dependent test, if they're going for the qualifying child test, their relationship. All of these will help you determine if they pass the test to be either a qualifying relative or a qualifying child in order to be a qualifying dependent, to allow them to take certain credits or refunds for their tax return. So, homework. For my students, I have them do small homework assignments that are questions prepared by the IRS from the Link and Learn website. Included in the guided notes document, there will be a homework section. So if you want extra practice determining certain cases, certain tests, this would be really useful to help kind of reaffirm the knowledge that you learned here today. But otherwise, I hope you learned something, and I hope I clarified a little bit of what a dependent is and what you need to be to qualify as a dependent. If you have any questions, please comment, and I will be sure to try and help clarify any information. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. See you next time.